This was a perfect garden. This was a perfect place that was created. You want nothing. In fact, you've got more than you need. You've got something in there that you're not supposed to have. That's how much you have. And what happens? One little serpent comes into the garden. That's because there are serpents in the garden. Don't forget that in your life. There are serpents in the garden. I don't care what kind of walls you build around your life. I don't care how perfect and serene you make it. Serpents will find their way into your garden. I wonder how many of you, your parents have tried to shelter you, try to keep you innocent as long as possible. But when you were like 10 years old, you found best gore on the internet. And you were watching like decapitation videos and stuff like that. No matter what kind of wall they tried to build, and you learned about life and death, the knowledge of life and death way too early. Or you encountered some things in your life way earlier than you should have. Maybe the serpent was, again, the internet. Maybe the serpent was the priest that they left you with. Maybe the serpent was someone that your family trusted. The serpent gets into the garden. The serpent gets through the walls. What we can do is hopefully give you a tool set for dealing with the serpents when they do show up. Because they will. They will show up in your life. The question is going to be, are you going to be prepared to deal with them? You guys are going to have children someday, and I'm sure that when they're born, you're going to look at them and just think, I want so much better for you than I had. I'm going to protect, no one's ever touching this kid. I'm protecting this kid with my life. Okay, guess what? A serpent's going to get through the wall somewhere. So what you do with your kids is hopefully you prepare them for those serpents so that when they appear, they'll know what to do. Because I'll tell you what, when did the serpent go to Eve? When she was by herself. When is that serpent going to go towards your kids? Well, when did the serpent get to you guys? Probably not in front of your parents. Probably when you're away from them. And when is that serpent going to go after your kids? When you're not around to protect them. Maybe I can shake you a little bit. So what is a doctrine? Okay. And so we've already named a few things. What are some things that we believe in very strongly, that we know for sure? Doesn't matter what you say, I'm going to tear it apart.
Oh, now I know what he wants to say. Come on, feel strongly about it.
What are like Messi like being like the best?
Right.
But like he doesn't know that.
You can't break that down.
But you can't like break it
It doesn't
down.
matter who you are.
Yeah, I don't think you can break it down.
So besides these things of like, who's the best player, something that's subjective, what's 2 plus 2?
4.
No.
Okay. Good. What was that?
I said, please don't.
Oh, I'm going to. That's what I do. Because last year there was a lot of controversy, quote unquote, about 2 plus 2. It can equal 5. You heard this? Yeah. And the funny thing is that it was an article that went viral, and it was by a guy who was a graduate student in mathematics, and he's at Harvard. So in the introduction, he wants us to know that he's at Harvard. And that at Harvard, he's learning that 2 plus 2 doesn't necessarily equal 4. It can, under very specific circumstances, equal 5. And then we listen to him, we're like, wow. And because he went to Harvard, we take it very seriously. Whenever I read stuff like that, I always think the same thing. I was accepted to Harvard. Keep that in mind. Next time you want to try to take Harvard seriously, just remember, this guy was accepted to Harvard. It doesn't necessarily mean anything good, man. All kinds of weirdos get to go there. Sorry. But having said that, that's something that we can actually objectively look at and say, well, 2 plus 2 equals 4. But there's a growing group of people who are coming along and trying to teach you that, no, 2 plus 2 can equal 5 under certain circumstances. But in order for that to happen, they have to get really convoluted and very obscure in their reasoning. And even with that, if you follow it, guess what? It still doesn't equal 5. It only equals 5 if you change the meaning of language, if you change the concepts of numbers, if you change the concepts of addition. So I guess the question becomes, why is it that somebody would come along and try to convince you of something so absurd and so stupid, by the way, that only someone with a PhD could possibly believe it? What is it that they're trying to obscure, and why? But there's something deeper underneath that. As I was sharing with my last class, it's this word meaning. What's this word meaning? In other words, I guess the question is, what does it mean if it's true that 2 plus 2 can sometimes equal 5? What's the meaning of that kind of a statement? What's it designed to do? Well, it's designed to make the world less clear for you. It's designed to obscure things for you. And this is why I say I don't trust a person who comes along and tries to change the meaning of words and tries to change the definition of words. Understand, they're not doing that to try to make the world clearer for you. They're doing that because they're trying to make it so that the world is harder to understand. Because once you can sit there and say, 2 plus 2, 4, throw up your hands. Screw it. I don't know. I guess nothing means anything. Well, if nothing means anything, now I can convince you that anything means what I want you to believe that it means. And so you start thinking about some of the absolute absurdities that we're coming along and we're wholeheartedly swallowing without any kind of a critical thought. And the thing is that most of us understand that the emperor is naked. But I guess the question is, why is it that so few of us are willing to be the child who points it out? I guess I was talking to my classes this morning. Women are just as strong as men. You know this, right? Anybody believe that? Any of you girls want to have a push-up contest with me? I'll fucking demolish you. I promise that. And then I'm sure that some of you in your head right now are thinking, that's not true. Because I know one girl in my 6th period class who can do like 50. I can do 50 with one hand. And that's the strongest example that you can come up with. Are men and women equally strong? No, of course not. Are we equally fast? No. Why? Well, is it because one is better than the other? No. Men have more fast twitch muscle fiber. We have more muscle mass. We have more of these other kinds of things. Oh, wow, it almost sounds like I'm saying that there's something biological about what it is to be male. But you know, some women have penises, right? And some men have periods. Ooh, that's scary for you. Oh, shit, he's going to go there. Because it makes you question, how is it that we were talking about gender 1 minute and suddenly now we're talking about sex? Like in my classes, I've had students who've said, like, you know, do I refer to people by their genders or whatever? I can just refer to you by your sex, make it easier. Uh-oh. That sounds like there's something biological that's there. And the thing is that we all intuitively know this. Whether you want to be called by something or not is entirely on you. And should we call people by things they want to be called? I imagine so. My first name is John. I don't go by John. I've never been called John. My dad's name is John. My brother's name is John. My sister's name is John. I don't know, man. My full name is John Stephen Joseph Slane Scanlon. I'm trying to figure out how my mom gave me so many names, but gave me such a generic first one. But I've been called Stephen my whole life, and so I go to, if I buy something online, I go to pick it up. I have to tell them, oh, John's here. I prefer to be called Stephen. But no one's under any obligation to call me Stephen, because that's not my first name. You should. It's kind. It's appreciative. It's appreciated. But to come along and say, no, you must, as soon as whatever comes after must has to go away, man. Because you're not creating a better world through that kind of a thing. What you're doing is you're creating a world of power. And if you don't do this, I'm going to fill in the blank, dox you. I'm going to report you. I'm going to try to get you fired. I'm going to try to do all these terrible things to you. You think that you're making that person a better person? No, you're making them angry, resentful. First chance they get, man, behind your back, they're going to do something. You're not making the world a better place. You're making the world a far, far more hostile place with that. I mean, this is something you all intuitively know. If we tell you, you must do this, how do you feel about that? In fact, better yet, I wonder how many of you, if I ask you, how many of you just over this whole school thing, you want to get the hell out of here, and you'll raise your hand. And then if I ask you, how many of you guys are going to be paying $20,000 a year to do what you're doing right now for free, sitting in a classroom listening to someone talk? Why will you pay a bunch of money next year? But you have to be dragged to class this year, because this year you're forced to. Next year, there's a choice attached to it. Don't you become better at that thing when you have a choice to do it? So when you try to come along and say, you must do, I don't have to do anything except for stay white and die. If you're willing to take the consequences for things, and will there be consequences? Well, yeah, but there's consequences either way. If someone comes along and someone can get you to nod along and say, 2 plus 2 equals 5, Yeah, fine. Well, there's a consequence that's attached to that. You can never be authentic. You're only a person who's being forced to do something. And it's not that you believe it, again, it's that you're being forced into it. You know, if someone is born with one sex and then they're telling you, you must call me, no. You should, maybe. It's nice to do it. But I don't know that your desire for something creates an obligation on my part. If I have let's say that my 7-year-old nephew comes along and he puts a towel around his neck and to make a cape, and he proclaims himself to be Napoleon. And I will say, whoa, Napoleon, here comes Napoleon, the emperor, and he walks around like Napoleon. But at some point, if he demands to take control of the Corsican armies, I need to step in with reality, right? You are not Napoleon. We'll call you Napoleon, we'll have some fun with it, but I'm under no obligation to call you Napoleon because you're not Napoleon. Because there's something greater than your feelings, which is reality, which is truth. And the problem is that is it true that my name is John? Yeah, it is. It is. How would I feel if you went around constantly going, hey, John, how about John? Hey, John, hand me your phone, John. Look, John. Now you're just being an asshole. That's not about doing the right thing. That's just about being an asshole. The problem becomes when I try to convince you that John is not my first name and that that's not reality. I can give myself a new name. Well, no, that's where we run into problems. Yeah. But here's my point. A doctrine, name it, whatever it is, whether it's religious, whether it's political, whether it's socio-political, we're only certain about these things if we don't understand them. All of the gender and sex stuff, it only becomes uncertain if you really stop and think about it. If you just accept it wholeheartedly, well, then it's easy to accept it wholeheartedly because you don't actually have to. How about this? Stuff makes sense until you think about it. Some of you in here are religious. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You believe that there's some ghost out there in the universe that made everything, and in this whole giant universe actually cares about you, but not about all the babies that die. Okay? All right. Says that he cares about you in the womb, but allows terrible, terrible things to happen in the world. Has the chosen people, the Jews, and then has the Holocaust. And you still believe that there's this God out there. Okay? Well, you're only certain about it if you don't think about those kinds of things. And if you're religious, if you're Christian, if you're Jewish, you realize that when you start with the first book of Genesis, you've got Genesis 1 and you've got Genesis 2. And it's very clear. 2 different people wrote those 2 chapters because they both tell stories about creation, and the stories that they tell are different. Did you notice that? Well, I've never actually read it. Well, yeah, that's the only way you can be certain about it if you've never read it before. The only way you can be certain about any of these doctrines is if you don't actually study them. The more you study it, the more doubts you have about things. Those of you who are not religious, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You believe that in the beginning there was nothing, and then suddenly it exploded, and here we are. You believe that? That that there can be nothing that just explodes? Okay, there's your Big Bang, there's your evolution. In the beginning there was nothing, and then it exploded. And some of you who are thinking, well, no, there's something out there, but, it's not some, old man and, some bearded guy out there in the sky who made everything. Instead, we're in a simulation. So you believe that there's some neck-bearded guy in his mom's basement playing a video game, and here we are. Yeah. We believe the strangest things when we don't actually examine them. Any doctrine at all, name it. As I was talking about my last class, it isn't so much about whether or not the stories that we tell are true. It's what they mean. Like when we accept something wholeheartedly without thinking about it, what does it mean that we do that? It doesn't mean that you're stupid. It doesn't mean that other people are stupid if they just believe these things. Is it possible for very smart people to believe that in the beginning there was nothing and then it exploded? Yeah. Is it possible for very smart people to believe that this is a simulation? Yes. Is it possible for very smart people to believe in the religions? Yes. Because they're all trying to do the same thing. They're trying to understand something about the universe around us. And there's that question about what does it mean? What's the meaning of all of this? In my last class it came up. I'm trying to remember the second example I used, but the first one, first question was, were Adam and Eve real? And then the next question was, do aliens exist? And I was telling him, it doesn't, they're interesting questions. But the really interesting part about that stuff is what it means underneath. So for example, were Adam and Eve real? Who cares? The story itself means something. It's important. If you guys don't know the story of Adam and Eve, the idea is that in the beginning, God creates these two people, Adam first, and then Adam complains to God and says, I wish I had someone to hang out with. There's your first problem, isn't it? Imagine if you're chilling somewhere and you've got the creator of the universe next to you, and you're like, you're cool and all, God, but can I have another human? Well, I mean, isn't that exactly what we do in life? For those of you who are religious, isn't God enough for you? Or is it that you have to seek the friendship of other people? That's a weakness in humanity, that we seek other people. And so God's kind of like sighs and is like, okay, I'll give you a helpmate. And then makes Eve. And then they're hanging out and they're chilling, everything's great. And he creates a perfect paradise for them, this Garden of Eden. Everything that they need is in there. And in fact, everything they don't need is not in there. One of the things they don't need is death. And that's one of the things that we're told it doesn't exist in the garden. That means they're not killing animals. That means they're just eating fruit. So they're vegetarians at the very beginning. And they can just chill next to the animals. Imagine that. You can just kind of sit there eating a pear next to a bear. I don't know why I said pear. I was thinking apple. You're sitting there eating an apple next to a bear, and the bear's just like, and then right next to him, this little rabbit goes by, and he's chilling because he's not worried about the bear eating him because there's no death in this place. It's a perfect paradise for all of us. And yet there was one thing that Adam still said, it'd be perfect if I had a chick. You're cool and all, God, but could you give me a woman? So he's like, okay. And then the very next scene, what do we see? Eve is walking around by herself. Yeah, there's a second lesson there, isn't there? I want this thing, I want that. Okay, here's another human being for you. Okay, cool. I'm going to go hang out with the boys. There are no other boys to hang out with, but, Adam leaves Eve by herself. Thought you wanted this thing, this is what you said you wanted. That tells us something. The audience is bullshit. We don't know what we need. We barely even know what we want. And oftentimes we don't know what we want until we get it. And then once we get it, we realize, that's too much of that. Like truth. And then the serpent goes to Eve. Oh, and that tells us something. What is the serpent doing in this perfect place? I guess it tells us that even a perfect place has serpents in it. And the serpent walks over, because he had legs in that day, it says, and is talking to Eve, and is just like, nice garden. And she's like, yeah, I like it. And she's like, well, can you eat something? All the trees, huh? Because God said you can eat from all the trees. Well, God had put one tree in the center of the garden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Sometimes people will say it's the tree of knowledge. No, the knowledge of good and evil. Before that, Adam and Eve didn't know the difference between good and evil. All they knew was good. They just did what God told them to do, and that was it. And he just said, eat of any tree. All of them. 100%, but not that one. And what do we do as humans? There's a meaning there, isn't there? There's a lesson there that we were learning. And again, you don't have to be religious to get these lessons. People will say, well, I'm not religious. Well, fuck. Yeah, you're also not 9 feet tall. Who cares? Can you get something out of this or not? That's the point of the story. Can you get something psychological about it? If you can, you understand some things about humanity, and you understand some things about yourself and about the whole world around you. This is, at the very least, this is what they are. They're psychological sketches. And so what does the serpent do? He says to Eve, well, so God said you can eat of any tree, huh? Is that what he said? No, he left out that part except for the one. She says, we're told we can eat of any of them except for that one. Why can't you eat of that one? Did God really say that? Oh, now you're questioning whether or not what God says is what God said. You're sowing doubt. Eve, God won't tell you this, but 2 + 2 can equal 5. Yeah. Intuitively, she understands that that's not the case. We all know that. But what's the serpent trying to do? Well, the same thing as a lot of professors. They want to dazzle you with bullshit. It makes sense if you don't think about it too much. Just take what I say. Never mind if what I'm telling you comports with reality. A person who tells you that 2 plus 2 can equal 5, I would ask you, no matter what their explanation, would you rather get on a plane made by people who believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Or would you get on a plane made by people who would say that 2 plus 2 can equal 5 under very specific circumstances from Harvard? And so she says, you can eat of any tree except for this one. Did God really say that? He did. And then what does the serpent do? You know why, though? Because God knows that in the day that you eat of that tree, you will become like him, knowing good from evil. And she's like, really? And what does she hear? I can become like God? She misses, there's nothing else in there that says you're going to have the power of him, you're going to have the majesty of him, you're going to control the angels. He just says you're going to become like him in this one little area. It's like if I said to you, you guys know that with one little action you can become like an angel. Really, what do I have to do? Just murder? Because you know Satan was an angel, right? You can make you like an angel. I want to be like an angel. Depends on which angel. And so he then convinces her by that statement that you can eat of any tree, and you can eat of any tree except for this one, but if you do eat of this one, you're going to become like God. And that's enough for her, man. What does she do? She wants to become her own God. She wants to create reality in her own image. 2 plus 2 can equal 5. Language doesn't mean anything. We can create this thing better than what God... Well, that's the exact same sin of Satan. He wants to overthrow and be his own God. And I'll talk to people today who will say things like, I'm my own God. What a shitty God. You can't even fix your hair. You're going to be a God. Yeah. And so she eats of the tree, and then when she realizes, oh yeah, she learns about knowledge of good and evil, and what comes along with that, the knowledge of death, knowledge of life, but also the knowledge of death. And what's the knowledge of death that she understands? It isn't just like, wow, death exists. She learns that she is going to die. She was made to be something immortal. Both of them were. And so, of course, Adam, because he's the smart one, he comes along, and he's like, oh my goodness, what have you done? And she's like, I ate this fruit. You what? Try it. She knows it's bad for her. She knows it's terrible. She knows that she's an awful thing. And what does she do? She offers it to her only friend in the world. And he's like, okay. And he eats it too. There's a meaning there. There's a story there. There's an important fact of humanity that's embedded in this story, another one. And so think about the friends that you surround yourself with, and think about the friend that you are. When you have a bad habit, do you seek now to pass it along to your friends and tell them it's good? Or do you kind of try to stop yourself or shield them away from it and say, don't do what I'm doing, don't do what I did? And are you that friend who says, well, if you're doing it, I'm doing it too. No matter what it costs, I'll do that. And so, what's the story there? Well, I guess a big part of it is, this was a perfect garden. This was a perfect place that was created. You want nothing. In fact, you've got more than you need. You've got something in there that you're not supposed to have. That's how much you have. And what happens? One little serpent comes into the garden. That's because there are serpents in the garden. Don't forget that in your life. There are serpents in the garden. I don't care what kind of walls you build around your life. I don't care how perfect and serene you make it. Serpents will find their way into your garden. I wonder how many of you, your parents have tried to shelter you, tried to keep you innocent as long as possible. But when you were like 10 years old, you found best gore on the internet. And you were watching like decapitation videos and stuff like that. I wonder what horrible stuff you have found on the internet because there was a serpent in the garden. No matter what kind of wall they tried to build, and you learned about life and death, the knowledge of life and death way too early. Or you encountered some things in your life way earlier than you should have. Maybe the serpent was, again, the internet. Maybe the serpent was the priest that they left you with. We all know about those. Maybe the serpent was someone that your family trusted. The serpent gets into the garden. The serpent gets through the walls. I can't make the world safer for you by killing all the serpents. There's too many of them. They're going to find their ways into the garden. What we can do is hopefully give you a tool set for dealing with the serpents when they do show up. Because they will. They will show up in your life. The question is going to be, are you going to be prepared to deal with them? You guys are going to have children someday, and I'm sure that when they're born, you're going to look at them and just think, I want so much better for you than I had. I'm going to protect, no one's ever touching this kid. I'm protecting this kid with my life. Okay, guess what? A serpent's going to get through the wall somewhere. So what you do with your kids is hopefully you prepare them for those serpents so that when they appear, they'll know what to do. Because I'll tell you what, when did the serpent go to Eve? When she was by herself. When is that serpent going to go towards your kids? Well, when did the serpent get to you guys? Probably not in front of your parents. Probably when you're away from them. And when is that serpent going to go after your kids? When you're not around to protect them. So, yeah, let that sink in. So does it matter whether or not Adam and Eve existed? Yeah, it matters to an extent, but it's really the meaning of it all. It's the meaning of it all. It's like, do aliens exist? Maybe. Maybe. Now think about why it is that we really, really want them to believe. And think about the kinds of things that we say. Well, look how big the universe is. Okay. So your argument is that the size of the room determines what's inside of it? All right. Now maybe you want to believe it, but the more you look at what it takes for life to emerge on the planet, it becomes damn near impossible. Impossible to imagine that there could be anybody else out there. So it's not saying there isn't. But man, when you look at it and you realize that it isn't just about the size of the universe. Even if you look at the number of planets and say, well, with all these trillions of planets, it's guaranteed. No, that's not how statistics work. You have to have at least two data points to compare. Where else have we found life in the universe? Nowhere else. Not saying it's not there. I'm just saying we haven't found it anywhere else. So statements like the odds of, there's no odds, man. There are no odds. You have to have at least 2 data points to make an odd statement. And we only have 1. So what we can say is that the chances of life occurring in the universe are at least 1 in 100 trillion. We might say that, but we can't say that it's any higher than that because we don't know. So I guess the question, though, is like, why is it that we want to believe in aliens so much? Because there are people who believe and go, I just look at it, I think it's possible, I think it's likely, blah, blah, blah. And then there are people who are like, it is their religion. They're out there. Why? Because, I don't believe in this whole, bearded guy in the sky who's going to come and solve all of our problems for us. But man, I hope the aliens are out there and they save us from ourselves. It's religion with a different name. That's all it is. It's just like the simulation theory. It's a religion with a different name because we're all programmed neurologically to worship something. We have a worship center of our brain. We all worship something. We all have a religion. The question is just, what is it? But all of those doctrines, again, we can only be absolutely certain about them if we don't think about them, because every doctrine has a point of doubt, has a point of uncertainty, has a weakness, and we should be aware of them. That's why he says we can be absolutely certain only about the things we don't understand. If we understand them, there's problems with it. If you're somebody, going back to the beginning, if you're somebody who has heard the thing about 2 + 2 = 5, if you understand why why that just isn't true, then at least you understand that some people believe it, and here's why. Regardless of what side you're on with the genderism, and understand that there are good people on both sides of it, and we should acknowledge that. You can only be 100% like fascist certain about either side if you don't understand the positions of either side. You can only be absolutely certain that God exists or doesn't if you don't understand the weaknesses on both sides. You can only be absolutely certain about aliens and simulations and all that if you don't know the arguments on both sides. So when you find yourself absolutely certain about something, it might be time to look at both sides of it. And that absolutely does not mean that therefore you just sit there and go, well, who knows? It's all subjective. No, almost nothing in the universe is subjective. Almost everything in the universe is objective. It's just a question of how much are you willing to invest of yourself in discovering the objective truth behind things. Because there are things that are worth knowing the truth about. There are some things that it would be nice to know the truth about, but they're not necessary for our existence. And so figuring out what those things are, and then, again, understanding them, that can take a whole lifetime. So I hope you guys have a whole lifetime ahead of you. You know, it'd be terrible to die without any certainty. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? It's not so bad, right? It wasn't offensive. I'm not going to be the principal's office, yeah?